Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde, and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful, as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the dull, grey Tuesday our story starts, there was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley good-bye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little tyke! Noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realise what he had seen. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night-time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the baker's opposite. The Potters, that's right. That's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He dashed back across the road to his office, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his moustache, thinking. No, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, He wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey. Or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. When he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry. Oh, don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day. Mr. Dursley walked off. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next-Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learnt a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living-room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird-watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. Most mysterious. And now, over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? No? Why? Funny stuff on the news. Owls, shooting stars. There were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? I suppose so. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty, common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes. Yes, I quite agree. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, it couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall. How did you know it was me? My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly. You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day. All day? When you could have been celebrating? Oh, I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here. Oh, yes, everyone's celebrating all right. You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. People are being downright careless, out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes. Oh, you can't blame them. We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. I know that, but that's no reason to lose our heads. A fine thing it would be if, on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about us all. I suppose, he really has gone, Dumbledore? We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a sherbet lemon? A what? A sherbet lemon. They're a kind of Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of. No, thank you. As I say, even if you-know-who has gone, my dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I've been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort. It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I've never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't, but you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you-know— Oh, all right, Voldemort was frightened of. You flatter me. Voldemort had powers I will never have, only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pumphrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. The owls are nothing to the rumours that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he's disappeared, about what finally stopped him. What they're saying is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumour is that Lily and James Potter that they're dead. Lily and James? I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. I know. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry. But he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke, and that's why he's gone. It's true. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? Well, it's just astounding. Of all the things to stop him, but how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess. Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be here, by the way. Yes, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left now. You don't mean— You can't mean the people who live here? Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find two people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here? It's the best place for him. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Really, Dumbledore, you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be, growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, but you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? Hagrid, at last. And where did you get that motorbike? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir. Young Sirius Black lent it me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the Muggles started swarming round. He fell asleep as we was flying over Bristol. Is that where... Yes. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in useful. I have one myself about my left knee, which is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We had better get this over with. Could I, could I say goodbye to him, sir?
No.
Shh! You'll wake the Muggles.
Sorry, but I can't stand it. Lily and James dead. Poor little Harry off to live with Muggles.
Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations.
Yeah, I'll be taking Sirius's bike back. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir.
I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall. Good luck, Harry. Harry Potter slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived."